Welcome to episode 29 of Touchstones Music. Continuing my series of music and albums from the 1960s that I purchased around that time, which have been musical touchstones for me ever since. Today, we're going to feature a group called The Band. The band had spent years honing their craft before bursting onto the music scene with an album that has had an enduring influence on music fans and musicians alike. From 1968, we feature their groundbreaking debut album, Music from Big Pink. Let's hear a little bit from that. This is a little bit from the song Tears of Rage. Okay, with the wonderful singing of Richard Manuel. The group, from left to right in this picture, was Rick Danko, bass, fiddle, vocals. Now, these were all multi-instrumentalists. I'm sort of giving you the instruments that they mainly listed as playing on this album, their first album. Levon Helm, drums and vocals. Richard Manuel, keyboards and vocals. Garth Hudson, keyboards, saxophone. Robbie Robertson, guitar and vocals. The three main vocalists of the group turned out to be Rick Danko, Levon Helm, and Richard Manuel. They were extremely fortunate to have three excellent singers. But we'll talk a little more about the singing later. So the group, which became known as The Band, was comprised of four Canadian and one American, that is Levon Helm, musicians. They had honed their craft together as rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins' backup group, the Hawks, between 1958 to 1963, playing mostly in and around the Toronto, Hamilton, Ontario circuit in Canada. After splitting with Hawkins, they spent time performing under such names as Levon and the Hawks and the Canadian Squires, playing bars and roadhouses both in Canada and the U.S. Towards the end of that period, they agreed to act as Bob Dylan's backup band when Dylan famously switched from acoustic to electric music for his 1966 tour. Levon Helm left the tour early on, however. He wasn't the only one of the musicians that contracted to do that because of the stress of the tour. Dylan was being booed in some places because his fans didn't like him going from acoustic to electric, although, of course, it turned out to be a seminal move on his part. After the tour, the group moved their center of operations to the house that ultimately was dubbed Big Pink, with help from Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, who later became their manager. They continued their collaboration with Dylan, writing and recording at Big Pink the songs which would later be released on the Basement Tapes album in 1975. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. They continued writing and performing on their own, eventually settling on the name The Band after the release of their first album. Critical point to mention, that was after the release. The band combined elements of folk and country music from the southern U.S., rock, R&B, and jazz. Robbie Robertson was credited with the majority of the songwriting credits, and this would become a future point of contention within the group. But let's talk about the recording of this album. Music from Big Pink was recorded early 1968, released in July of the same year. Studios were AR in New York and Capitol in Los Angeles. The label was on Capitol. Now, it made a U.S. Billboard pop albums number 30, very respectable, and they had a single, The Wait. Flip side was I Shall Be Released, and these peaked at number 63 on the Billboard's Hot 100s chart. The album cover, well, let's talk about the title first. Big Pink is the name locals had reportedly given to the pink-colored house the group rented in West Saugerties, New York, as their live-in practice center. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that Saugerties right. The cover, well, you notice the front cover. It's a painting, actually, by their friend Bob Dylan that he sort of donated. But you notice there's no band name on it. That's because they actually hadn't picked a name yet. They had not yet decided on one and were simply known by friends and family as The Band. And sooner or later they thought, well, that's actually not a bad name. So they adopted it as their official moniker, so to speak. Now, I usually talk about my impressions at the time I purchased it, and my memory fails me on just when or why I purchased this album. I had seen the band live in the summer of 1970, which might have been the catalyst to buy the record at that time, or I might have bought it sooner. I'm not sure. Initially, my clear favorite song on the album was Chest Fever. Garth Hudson has this majestic organ sound. It's fantastic. But I've since come to appreciate all the songs equally for their superb craftsmanship. Now, while I see Bob Dylan's influence all over this record, not surprisingly because they spent a lot of time with Bob, I had not grown up with his music like so many of my contemporaries had, and only later came to truly appreciate Dylan's music. Perhaps that's why it took me a while to warm up to the band's music also, but eventually I've become a huge band fan. Now let's talk about the vinyl. You'll notice that the songs are either written by members of the band or co-written with Bob Dylan, or there's a Bob Dylan song in here as well, written by him alone, which shows they just have really good taste in music. Let's hear a little bit from Kingdom Come. Again, Richard Manuel, by my count, is on 7 of the 11 songs, something like that, as the main vocalist. And to me, his voice was the vocal sound of this album, and gave it so much of its flavor. Again, side 2, as we see, either written by members of the band. There is one, Long Black Veil, that was written by a couple of other folks, but mostly it's either the band or Bob Dylan, the band, or Bob Dylan. We'll listen to a little bit about We Can Talk. And that's, of course, Levon Helm adding the main vocals there at that point. So as I said, 7 of the 11 songs, the band's early song was Richard Manuel. And his voice really was, to me, early on, the voice of the band. Later, of course, Rick Danko and Levon Helm also added their wonderful vocals, and it became more of a blend. The group would go on to record 7 more albums before releasing the Last Waltz album and movie set. The movie was directed by the famous director Martin Scorsese. Of their final performances, according to Robertson, the retirement after The Last Waltz was never intended to be permanent. They were sort of taking a respite to allow the members to rest, pursue individual projects, but acrimonies between members and personal issues, including, I'm sorry to say, some drug issues, combined to prevent a full regrouping of the original members, however. Now, musicians from Eric Clapton to George Harrison of the Beatles to Roger Waters of Pink Floyd have cited music from Big Pink as a turning point in rock history. It has been credited as spawning the Americana music genre and as a major influence on roots rock, so-called. I did see the group again on tour, minus Robbie Robertson. Later, I'm struggling to remember when I saw them, as I'm not sure when they came to my area. They were still wonderful performances and musicians. They had another fellow playing guitar who did a creditable job. Although I don't think anybody could really replace Robbie Robertson. Certainly not in the hearts of the fans like myself. But I mean, the fellow was fine, and the rest of them were still wonderful performers. Like all our fans, I had always hoped that someday they would bury their differences and reform, and regretfully, that was not to be. So this album is another one of my touchstones. I hope it will be for other music fans as well. That's a quick one today, but I really enjoy this album, and I know you will too if you listen to it. And as I say, there's a lot of other band music that you can find. Just follow the string from this one on. That's all for this edition. Be well, and thanks for joining me. Bye now.